So welcome to History Pub. Yes. So I'm Debbie Monsiv. I'm the president of Cottage Grove Genealogical Society, and I help coordinate the History Pub. As you all probably know, we're in a historic building on our historic Main Street. This building was built in 1908. There was another brick building in this footprint before by a general merchandise as well, but this is the Burkholder Woods merchandise store. I want to thank Bart for this wonderful venue and the staff, his staff, for serving us all tonight. They do an excellent job. And Bart's also very generous and donates prizes, so that's great. I want to thank Seth for the audio-visual, and Jim Lockhart for capturing our history pubs on video, and those are available on the Cottage, the old ones are on the Cottage Grove Genealogical Society's YouTube, and the ones from last year and this year are on the CG Partners in History YouTube channel. And I want to thank Heather Endicott for creating our fabulous posters that we do quarterly. But most of all, I want to thank all of you for coming out and supporting this venue. And the 2026 sponsoring partners in history are the Cottage Grove Historical Museum, the Cottage Grove Genealogical Society, the Cottage Grove Historical Society, the Cottage Grove City Library, Singing Creek Educational Center, Oregon Aviation Historical Society, and last but not least, Spirit of Bohemia Mining Days. And tonight we have Matthew from the Spirit of Bohemia Mining Days going to give us the history of the Bohemia Mining District. And I just want to say that half of the 50-50 raffle will go to the Spirit of Bohemia Days organization. And so Matthew was born at the old Cottage Grove Hospital in the summer of 1995. At around the age of 7, Matthew and his family moved to Florence, Oregon, and lived at Camp Cleowalks until his freshman year of high school. They moved back to Cottage Grove, and he graduated from Cottage Grove High School in 2013. Matthew entered the workforce and found his way through fast food, retail, industrial painting, caregiving, then maintenance work at senior living facilities. Matthew began his involvement in Bohemia Mining Days in 2019 as the Bohemia City jail cell photo booth. He was the jailer. Anyway, he revived a decades old tradition unknowingly. He found his love for the Oregon Wild West around 2022, and at that time, in 2024, Matthew and around 30 other people came together to ensure that Bohemia Mining Days would be able to celebrate its 65th anniversary. Late in 2024, Matthew incorporated Spirit of Bohemia Mining Days as a 501c3 nonprofit. Matthew took up the executive director role for the organization and has established Spirit of Bohemia Mining Days as a year-round educational heritage hub emphasizing on youth, cultural education, content creation, and historic preservation. And he does a darn good job. Thank you, Matthew.
Well, thank you all for coming this evening. I gotta say, I'm super honored about the crowd here tonight. You guys I see quite a few dedicated historians in our crowd, and we've got a good crowd here. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, the Axe and Fiddle, for hosting us and providing prizes. Take good notes tonight, because we've added a little gift bag for the first place trivia prize. A bunch of Bohemia Mining Days related goodies. So, and photos by Greg Lee of 14 years the past Bohemia Mining Days? So, 15 years. So, we've also got a bunch of thumb drives over there if you'd like to donate to Spirit of Bohemia Mining Days. Greg will give you a thumb drive for that. But anyway, thank you for being here. As you can tell, my presentation this evening is going to be on the history of the Bohemia Mining District. And because I went a little wild on this presentation, it starts long before people ever show up. I got a little distracted while making it, and I think you're going to enjoy this. Little disclaimer here. I am just a regular guy that happens to like history. I don't have a degree or anything like that, but I sure do try my best to get the most accurate history possible. But if any of you have ever experienced researching historical things, you're probably aware that you hit some road bumps along the way, and I've made a graph here to explain some of these road bumps. That's when I learned something that I thought I knew that I didn't know at all, and it totally invalidated stuff I thought I knew, but then I learned more right after that. So this presentation is going to be about the land, the people, and the boom afterwards, and the aftermath. And then a couple of credits here. We get a lot of our historic material from the other places around town, such as the Cottage Grove Genealogical Society, the Gold Mining Museum, the Historic Society, Cottage Grove Museum, the Seacords, Deborah Monsif, Steve Williamson, Dan Hill, Dana Maraday, Barbara N. Hellick, Noel Bandy, Ray Nelson, Ivan Hoyer, and Casey Woodard. So we get our history from a lot of other very talented historians in Cottage Grove, and it's up to me to interpret all that. So we start our story at the Eocene epoch, somewhere between 36 and 45 million years ago. This is important because if this didn't happen, there wouldn't be any land here. So the Eocene epoch explains that the land that used to be Oregon a long time ago was actually a sea. It was actually the ocean. It was the Pacific Ocean. And during this time frame, we see the land rise up, and you see the Cascade Range come into effect and the Coastal Range come into effect through volcanic activity. Now, keeping this relevant to the gold, volcanic activity is how we get gold here on the surface. Gold rises up through the volcanoes, whether it be through magma or water or any other fluid. It melts, rises up with the rising pressure and the high temperatures, and then lands in the land or on the land, depending on what kind of volcanic activity it is. The first mammals we see in Oregon are the Orohippus, the Orodonts, Brontotherium, and Nimravus, and a bunch of others I didn't have room to put on this slide. The interesting thing about this, dinosaurs did not roam Oregon because it was an ocean before when the dinosaurs roamed the earth. I thought these were kind of interesting creatures, so I wanted to touch on them just for a second. We see the Orodonts, and I could be mispronouncing that. If anyone knows, please feel free to interrupt me. But these were as abundant here in Oregon as zebras on the African Serengeti, supposedly. And I'm pretty darn sure that my Uncle Roger has a rock with orodont bones in it, but I have no way to prove that. The Orohippus, this was kind of an interesting mini horse. It's about the size of a corgi, maybe a shepherd. So these things had 4 toes in the front and 3 in the back, which I thought was an interesting fun fact about this mammal. Moving forward, some amount of time later, we see the Willamette Valley during the Ice Age. You can see on that picture on the left here where the original coast would have been roughly 20,000 years ago. That's pretty interesting to me because there was likely animals and potentially even humans that settled in that area off the coast off our current coastline, and then at some point between then and now, that coastline sank. You'll notice that the Willamette Valley up there, Lake Allison would have been either wetlands, riverbeds, or a lake. I thought this was wildly interesting. This is the Neskowin Ghost Forest just north of Lincoln City. This is proof that the Oregon coastline did at one point sink, because these are tree stumps that were submerged under a certain amount of sediment, and that has eroded over time to create these calcified trees. I think that's pretty darn cool. One more map just to kind of show the different waterways that we see in Oregon and Washington because of the glacial runoff. I looked at a bunch of different maps to try and get my facts straight here. The thing is, nobody knows anything about what happened that long ago because no one was there that wrote it down. But we see a bunch of different maps that show the ice sheets at different stages depending on what era of history we're in. And on this map, we see it goes all the way up towards Seattle, but on some of the other maps I found and may have used later, the ice would have gone all the way down into Oregon through the Cascade Range. Some of the first life apart from those prehistoric mammals we saw in Oregon would have been mammoths, mastodons, ancient bisons, ground sloths, beaver, wolves, bear, large cats, and I didn't put it here, but camels, which I thought was wildly interesting. Now, what's Bohemia doing at this point? We don't really know, but what we can safely assume is that it looked much different than it did today. We see Bohemia as more of an ice sheet, a tundra, less than forest land today. If any of you have ever been out into the Bohemia Mining District, it's very beautiful. You know, lots of evergreens, lots of really Oregon native foliage out there, but at this point in history, it likely would have been just ice. And this map here shows what was likely the case at this point in history. We see the Cascade Range covered in snow, and that is the rough location of where Bohemia Mountain would be on this map. I think it's really interesting to note that a lot of eastern Oregon has some really significant lakes. We see the Willamette, the Willamette Valley covered in water. We see that area to the northwest of the Willamette Valley that I don't know the name of, up in Washington, covered in water. And then we see a good portion of southern Oregon covered in water. And fun fact, Oregon, from peak to riverbed, has the biggest river gorge in the entire United States. But it dwarfs the Grand Canyon. The first tales of human life in Oregon begin as of a couple weeks ago, from what I understand. Within a couple of months ago, they estimate it was around 18,250 years ago. There was recently a dig out in eastern Oregon that showed or proved human life was here almost 20,000 years ago. The reality is we have no way to know for sure what that looked like, where they came from, but it's safe to assume that if we had early settlers in eastern Oregon, we likely had early settlers here in the Willamette Valley, and they would have used the mining district as well. But moving forward into that, we see that 8,000 years ago, these people begin camas processing and food intensification. And then as of 3,000 years ago, we see permanent Kalapuya village societies. So through my research, I found an immense amount of material that assumed the earliest human inhabitants in the Willamette Valley were some sort of Neolithic civilized people. You know, that's words that they would use. The fact of the matter is, these were the ancestors of the Kalapuya people here in the Willamette Valley. And they would use the valley the same way that they would use the mountaintops. They'd go back and forth between the two. But the Kalapuya primarily resided here in the valley floor. But the reality is these earliest settlers were not Neolithic. They weren't cavemen, they weren't Neanderthals, they were just earlier ancestors of the Kalapuya people. This is an example of some mounds. So along the Kalapuya River and along the Willamette River, there's a whole bunch of mounds that they excavated to find this information. These mounds contained kitchens, they contained pottery, they contained food sources, and some of them contained trash, some of them were burial mounds, all sorts of things. This is an example of a real mound that was found along near Brownsville, I believe. Some of the findings from these early mound sites were some of these tools you see in the lower right here. The text is way too small and I forget exactly what they are, but they had a purpose. The important part about this is we see these Clovis point arrowheads. Clovis, I believe, is the type of arrow that was used, and they dated it back to roughly 13,000 years ago. But you see that middle point right there was one that was found here in Cottage Grove, Oregon. So it shows that as of 13,000 years ago, at the very least, we had human inhabitants here in Cottage Grove. We're going to move forward in time just a little bit into what is more or less the Common Era. We see Bohemia on this map at the barrier of many different indigenous nations. We have the Yoncalla Kalapuya to the east of Bohemia. We have the southern Molalla to the west, the southern Molalla to the east, and then a variety of different peoples all around Oregon. The interesting thing about this is the area that is known as the Bohemia Mining District wasn't ever a regularly used place. Most folks that would come through this area, they would use it seasonally. They would go up to hunt or to gather, and this was primarily the Molalla. Like I said, the Kalapuya were more valley-dwelling peoples, but the Molalla didn't hesitate to climb mountains. And they would go up there to harvest the camas, to hunt for elk, and deer, and bear, and all that sorts of stuff. So this is a shared landscape. One of the other reasons that peoples from all of these nations at the time would go up into the mountains would be to get into the hot springs. Steamboat hot springs was one of the ones that was documented as having regular indigenous use, and these would be used for rest, healing, ceremony, and other practical needs. But the Steamboat hot springs are only one of many along the Cascade Range that there are hot springs. We're familiar with Belknap and Cougar hot springs. There are some privately owned hot springs up in the Bohemia Mining District that are on private land, so you can't access them, but there's a variety of those along the Cascades because of that early history. These are, or were at one point, volcanoes. And with volcanoes comes geothermic activity. So I was sharing this slide with Dave Light, and he mentioned that I should include the Lost Bohemia Trail. And I thought that that was an interesting concept because I couldn't find anything about it anywhere. So take it with a grain of salt, but this account here is provided by Dave Light, who I know is a good historian and does his due diligence on making sure that his facts are straight. But supposedly this lost trail was an indigenous trail running east to west into Bohemia. These would be used by the Molalla and other tribes going over the mountain range and into the valley to trade with the Kalapuya peoples. But this trail has not been found, supposedly. At least it's not been documented that's been found. Speaking a little bit about the Molalla peoples, from what I understand, these folks were mountain-oriented indigenous folks. Their core lifeways centered around the Cascade Range and its foothills, and their territory was from Mount Hood south toward Mount McLaughlin. And then we have the Kalapuya, who was the primary peoples in this area. Interesting fact about the Kalapuya. On that previous map that I showed with all of the different indigenous tribes throughout Oregon, the Kalapuya peoples were very autonomous tribes. They would work independently from each other. They didn't necessarily even speak the same language. They could communicate and get the point across, but each individual tribe and each nation, so to speak, would have their own language, and it would be somewhat of a barrier when they came together to do trading, but a lot of them did speak similar languages, or in the same way that we do today, they had translators that would get the information back and forth. These folks were primarily around northern, central, and southern Willamette Valley. And this image here was it's titled The Costume of a Kalapuya Indian. I wanted to make a point on that because the correct word that's supposed to be said now is regalia, because costume implies that it's for fun, it's not real, but this is the kind of thing that they would wear on a day-to-day basis. So because it was written in a time in 1841 when the language was different, I now have the opportunity to tell you that regalia is the proper term, but the title of this drawing is Costume of a Kalapuya Indian. So all the native folks in and around Oregon really had a very similar life path. The dry months, they would spread out and be really seasonal. They wouldn't stick to one specific place. During the winter they would build dedicated shelters or house themselves in the forest to stay out of the heavy weather. Neither time was idle. I've been reading a book called The Kalapuyans, a source book on the Indians of the Willamette Valley. I believe it was written in the 1950s, but it documents that the way these peoples remember before white settlers came, they didn't till the ground in the same way we do. Their food grew abundantly on the trees and throughout the land, and they would manage that well through uncontained, but contained burns. And they would migrate through different areas to be able to utilize the land, and once they had gotten through, burned an area, they'd migrate, and eventually they'd find their way back to that same land, which is now prospering with abundant material, abundant food sources. So they didn't work hard in the same way that we would consider today. They spent a lot of their time living very peacefully. Skipping forward just a little bit and away from Bohemia just a little bit, we enter the ocean. The first Europeans to arrive to Oregon by sea were actually the Spanish. 1542 to 43, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, he was one of the first people to come into the Oregon coastline. The thing is, throughout the 1600s, all of the Spanish didn't make, as far as we know, they didn't make any stops. The coastline was too rough for them, and they really just stayed off the coast, but they were documenting the coastline. Cabrillo, he was specifically heading up because he was tracking the Mexican coastline. At the time, California was part of Mexico, so he was going all the way up. And when he saw the Oregon land, he didn't make land. He didn't come aboard. He didn't get on the land, however the proper way to word that is. And then we see a couple other fellas, maybe Sir Francis Drake passed by in 1579. The first real land, the first time they make land, whatever the phrase I'm trying to think of is Yes, thank you. It was right around 1775. Hezida, I didn't write down his first name, but Hezida his task was to go up and down the Oregon coastline to find places that he could make landfall. So Hezida and Bodega y Quadra, they sail north, and if you didn't know, one of the places that they stopped would have been Heceta Beach in Florence, Oregon. Hence the name Heceta Beach and Heceta Head Lighthouse and all that stuff. It is Heceta, not Hecate, as some people might misunderstand. Anyway, they really didn't stay too long. By the 1800s, Spain really take off. They don't have any interest in continuing with their Pacific Northwest venture. So, right at the beginning of 1805, we see the Lewis and Clark expedition. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark traveled all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast to find the ocean in Oregon. At that time in history, Oregon, shortly after this moment in history, the Oregon Territory would have engulfed all of Oregon, all of Washington, and all of British Columbia, or this might be shortly after this moment. That is their entire path that they took from East Coast to West Coast. And I made a note to myself to write down how long it would have taken them, and I didn't do that. But for context, and we get into this in a later slide, it would take people on the Oregon Trail 6 to 8 months to get from one side to the other. Actually, I do remember. I think it took Lewis and Clark 2 years. Don't quote me on that. That's an estimate, but I think it took them 2 years. So, why the Lewis and Clark expedition matters for Bohemia? Well, obviously, if Americans didn't go find Oregon, we wouldn't be here being Americans. So, they never went into the mining district. They pretty much stayed along the Columbia River Gorge and made their way to the ocean. But this is an important moment in Oregon's history, in the Bohemia Mining District's history, because without this, who knows what American influence would look like today. So we begin the fur era. Fur trappers from Europe, from England really, fur trappers from British-ruled areas start coming into the area, and then American fur trappers start coming into the area. And the first fur trapping company we see in Oregon specifically is actually the Pacific Fur Company, and they established Astoria right around 1811. Shortly after that, the Northwest Company comes in, and they start digging around in all our furs and looking for beaver. This is what Astoria would have looked like around 1813. And then we see the big name in fur trapping, the Hudson's Bay Company. Hudson's Bay at some point established themselves at Fort Vancouver in Washington, but right around 1827, they decide they want to move south of the Columbia River, and they want to start exploring this area. One of the things that the fur trappers did here in Oregon and throughout the Willamette Valley was they would create what was known at the time as a fur desert. Fur deserts were so overly hunted that it would eliminate the population of whatever they were hunting, so that other fur trappers couldn't go into that area and make any money. At this point, I thought it was a good moment for a joke. So you meet a man on the Oregon Trail. You ask him, "What's your name?" And he says, "Terry." And you go, "Ha, Terry, that's a girl's name." And then he shoots you. You have died of dysentery. I appreciate that. So, if any of you had ever played the Oregon Trail, you get that joke. I had to explain it to a couple of folks before I got here. Anyway, Throughout the early 1800s, the Hudson's Bay Company really held practical control over Oregon. And the Anglo-American Convention of 1818 created a joint occupation in the Oregon country, which allowed British citizens and American citizens to start coming and inhabiting the land. At that point, there was no boundary line. So, in the early 1830s and 40s, the missionaries and settlers began to surge into the Willamette Valley following the Oregon Trail. So, American populations quickly outweigh the British, and the British starts to pull out of Oregon. But we're still in a legal battle over Oregon. We want to figure out what's really ours and what's really Canada's. So we established the Oregon Treaty of 1846, which ends joint occupation, and then the border of the United States is set on the 49th parallel. And then Oregon and Washington become the Oregon Territory at this point. So in the early 1840s, we go from fur trappers to settlers, and Jason Lee establishes a mission near present-day Salem in 1834. Letters headed back out east were selling Oregon, really explaining that there's fertile land, a mild climate, and resources here. And we see a surge of immigrants from the East Coast coming into the West Coast. So, 1843 onward, thousands take the 2,000-mile Oregon Trail, and we see that this is an example of what a covered wagon would have looked like at the time. A lot of the landscapes along the Oregon Trail and throughout Oregon were open and shaped by long indigenous land management. Oh, important to note that I almost forgot. At this point in history, near Cottage Grove starts becoming settled. We start seeing farms and small communities right in the southern tip of the Willamette Valley, but that is folks that are coming down from Portland from the Oregon Trail through the Willamette Valley and finding refuge here that they want to stay in. This also symbolizes the moment, well, it doesn't symbolize, it is the moment that we displace the indigenous population here. You know, there's so much I learned throughout the course of making this presentation, and I had to eliminate so much information so that you weren't going to be here for 4 hours. I forget the exact treaty name, but in 1851, the indigenous populations of Oregon start meeting with the American government, and they start working out where can you go, where do you want to go, and where are we going to put you ultimately. So the early 1850s starts this process, and it extends for a number of years. So this is a fellow that some of you might recognize. I sure hope so, because there's a wonderful museum down in Yoncalla about this fella. Jesse Applegate is one of the first people to really make a secondary route into the Willamette Valley. He takes the route of connecting the Willamette and the Umpqua valleys, and he was one of the first settlers in the area. He obviously decided to long-term settle in the Umpqua Valley in Yoncalla, but he established good relationships with Chief Hewlett of the Kalapuya tribe that lived between Yoncalla and Cottage Grove. They migrated to different places, but they had a really good relationship. And fun fact, he actually stood in front of Chief Hewlett when the Indian agents came to remove Chief Hewlett and his family. He stood in front of that agent with a gun pointed at him and said, "You're not taking my friend." So that was really cool. Jesse Applegate, at his own expense, opens a new wagon road into the southern Willamette Valley, meeting immigrants at Fort Hall to guide them. We see the Applegate Trail shifting from part of the Oregon Trail down south into Nevada, California, and then up through southern Oregon. Like I mentioned a moment ago, they ultimately end up building their life in the Umpqua Valley, but he's still a very important figure for our area because that route that was known as an easy wagon road wouldn't have been found, at least as quickly, without him. At this point, I imagine you're asking, how long is my talk really? Because we still haven't even got to any of the gold mining. I know what you came here. I know why you came here. Don't worry. We're getting there. All right. Moving a little bit further away from Oregon, we see gold fever hitting California right around 1848. The first gold to be found in California, I didn't look up where it was because honestly I didn't care. I only really cared about this. But in 1851, the first gold to be found in Oregon was in Josephine Creek and then Rogue River tributaries. Because of that, miners from California that were getting tired of the overabundance of other miners and other people started migrating up this way. Same with Nevada and California. They both headed up north. Of the first people to find gold in Oregon is one of these folks was Luther Hasbrouck. And this is a picture of Luther Hasbrouck, who is in the prospecting party of folks that found the first gold right along Josephine Creek and the Rogue River. So, of some of the other prospecting party was Nathan Giles, Moses Dusenberry, George Wells, Henry Lawrence, John Collins, John Twentyman, and Captain Jennings. Spring of 1850, prospectors crossed the Siskiyou Mountains into the Rogue River, and the first mining in Oregon starts at Big Bar on the Rogue River in Jackson County. And then later richer strikes, like Josephine Creek, triggered the bigger Southern Oregon rush. Now let's bring us back home. This fella is one of the most influential figures in our entire history because it was he that truly found gold first in the Bohemia Mining District. Him and a couple of other folks. Dr. William Willis Oglesby had Cottage Grove roots. He came over from Illinois and settled here in Cottage Grove in 1853 at only 16 years old. A couple of years later, he starts prospecting and he finds gold, but I'll tell you that in a minute. In his later years, 1877, he went from a miner to a doctor and got his doctorate at Willamette University. I believe he was also the mayor of Junction City at one point. I didn't write that down, but I feel like I read that. Thank you, Steve. Steve is really the Oglesby expert here. Anyway, the first excursion into the mining district that found gold would have been by Dr. Oglesby and Frank Brass. So here's an interesting thing. I made this change today. I made this change 2 hours ago on this presentation. There are conflicting reports about whether it was O.P. Adams, Oglesby, Rufus Adams, and William Shields to find gold first, or whether it was Oglesby and Frank Brass. For those that don't know, Frank Brass is who named Bryce Creek. It was originally Frank Brass Creek, and because of how language changes over time, it became Bryce Creek. But those two were obviously friends. It is my belief, and I have not found evidence yet, but I believe based on the evidence that I've read, that Oglesby and Brass were actually the first people to find gold around the Bohemia Mining District. And then shortly after that, Oglesby made friends with the Adams fellas and Shields to go find gold on Sharps Creek in 1858. So at this point, we are touching on what is known as placer gold. Placer gold is what you can find in a creek and pick up with your hand. Lode gold is what is known as in the rock. You have to mine it, or free gold. I don't know why they called it free gold, but it's one of the other terms. Shortly after finding gold in the Bohemia Mining District, Adams and Frank Bowie traveled to Josephine County because they want to know how to better find gold. So they go down there because there's active claims happening in Josephine County, and there's a lot more people there that know a lot more things about finding gold. So they head down there to try and learn a couple of skills, and they acquire themselves a whipsaw and make their way back up to Cottage Grove. In 1859, they established themselves at a place called Sailor's Gulch, which, if you've gone up into the mining district, if you've gone the Sharps Creek route, Sailor's Gulch is just within walking distance of the Mineral Campground. I forget which claim it's in front of, but yeah, I can't remember. But it's right in that area. These folks install a sluice box on Sailor's Gulch, and they start being able to acquire a little bit more than what was known as a handsome little stake in 1858. Oh, important note here. They're still chasing placer at this point, but nobody has found gold in the rock at this point. In fact, O.P. Adams makes his way looking for more placer gold in the mountains, and he ends up naming Adams Mountain, or being the result of naming Adams Mountain and finding Grouse Mountain. His entire search throughout that area really leaves him not able to find any lode gold. He's entirely looking for placer and overlooks any quartz veins that might be in the area. At this point, the Civil War is starting to take off, and we see everything really kind of go quiet here, except for one guy. Well, two guys, I guess. This is the story, this is the fella that gets he named Bohemia Mountain and named the mining district after himself, and I've not proven it because I can't find any information on it yet, but there was a place in Josephine Creek known as Johnson's Diggings, and it's my impression that this fella that really liked naming things after himself would have likely been involved in that other one as well, but Johnson's a really popular name, so we're just kind of speculating at this point. The story of James Bohemia Johnson goes they were on the run from Roseburg after supposedly killing a Native American man. They took the North Fork of the Umpqua up to Steamboat Creek and into City Creek, which, if you don't know, is the real long way to get into Bohemia Mining District. They were running from the law, but they settle for a time at City Creek. Near the headwaters of City Creek, the story goes that Johnson was dressing a deer by City Creek, and he saw something glittering in the water. And he found what he claimed was lode gold in the water. Or free gold in this particular instance, same thing. Mystery is just a small jaunt away from what is known as Bohemia City now, at the music mine. Mystery would have been the supposed location of the original Bohemia City, but we'll get to that in a second. So Johnson strikes gold in 1863. I want to make something else somewhat clear here. Johnson, my theory is, he didn't say a word to George Ramsay. My theory is that he saw the gold, didn't say anything, and told George Ramsay, you need to get out of here, you need to go home, we're on the run from the law, you can't be here, we're not safe. Because George completely disappears from the story at this point. I think it's pretty safe to say that Johnson told George, get the heck out of here, and then came back a short while later to go make some money. He claimed at the time to have been the first to find gold in the area, and I've been working hard to disprove that because I think his story isn't nearly as cool as Oglesby's. The name Bohemia is somewhat of a mystery. The theory at one point was that he or his family was from Czechoslovakia, but the thing is, we don't know. There's not enough information, but the information that we do have suggests that he didn't come from Czechoslovakia, and neither did his relatives. So why he nicknamed himself Bohemia is a mystery, but he stuck with it, clearly. So, right in the middle of the Civil War is when he starts really showing folks that this is serious. So, or shortly after the Civil War, more or less, O.P. Adams comes back into the story at this point, having been not satisfied with whatever he found on Sailor's Gulch. J.W. Vaughn, bird farrier, and up to around 100 others, give or take, start going into the area, and they start establishing what was known before as the Old City, or Old Bohemia City, which is where I expect was on the music mine. They start establishing this place, and then, you know, clearly 100 plus claims were established in between 64 and 65. In 66, the first formal rules start applying to this area, and the Bohemia Mining District becomes real in the eyes of the government. They established a miner's code of laws, which explained how big your claim can be, how big your town lot can be, and a variety of other things. And they sent that over to the state of Oregon to establish themselves, and I believe it was 1867 that the state of Oregon responded, said, "That's good, we like it, go ahead." So yeah, May 1867, Bohemia City is now the main settlement of the Bohemia Mining District. If any of you have been up there, you understand that it's there's some serious snowfall up in that area, especially this time of year. I haven't been out that way recently, but I expect that if I were to try right now, I wouldn't make it very far. So, in 1867, this is where the story turns to gold, literally. In 1867, Bird Farrier sells the Excelsior claim to Joseph Knott for $900, and that equates to roughly $20,000 today. By 1868, a population of over 100 men are here, and we see other infrastructure starting to take place, like the Spanish Rostra down below the mountain, cabins, hotels, saloons, and a Douglas County Recorder branch office. The Knott Trail opens right around 1870. This is so one thing I'm confused about. Joseph Knott bought a claim. Levi Knott gets the honor of making the trail. History is a funny way of mixing up names, and I'm not sure if that's the case here. You know, as I mentioned in my second slide, I'm just a regular guy, but I'm trying my best here. Anyway, the Knott Trail was built in 1870, and it extends from Red Bridge all the way out Culp Creek, up Adams Mountain, over the Utopia Saddle, and into the Champion Saddle. It was recorded that somewhere between 30 and 300 workers, including white and Chinese labor, built this trail. Levi Knott's stamp mill, see Levi, Joseph, you know. Levi Knott hauled a 5-stamp mill up this trail, and I don't know about you, but I've seen this stamp mill out in front of the Cottage Grove Museum over on Birch Avenue. Have any of you seen this stamp mill? Can you imagine trying to pull that, even with a team of oxes, up a hiking trail? I can't. I don't know what was up with this guy, but anyway, he bought this thing from San Francisco and had it shipped to Portland, and then upriver to Eugene, and then a wagon to Red Bridge. The final haul was over the Knott Trail by sled with 16 oxes with a Chinese labor crew. The mill was erected near Grouse Mountain summit before snowfall. So this is a little post when this event would have happened, because the original knot mill was actually crushed in 1877, but it gives you an idea of what the area might have looked like. This is the knot mill as of 1890 on the Bohemia claim used by the Annie mine. In the 1870s, we see the first collapse of the Bohemia Mining District. Early milling, right around 350 tons, $4,700. Later, 75 tons, $1,060. The problem with trying to do any milling and ore finding and all that at the top of a mountain is there's no water there. So you have really limited ways to get the gold out of the dirt, basically. We see circled on this map is the Annie mine, which would have been founded by Dr. William Oglesby, named after his daughter, Annie Oglesby Graham. Anyway, in 1877, heavy snow crushes the original mill building and interest in the camp is deserted. For roughly 15 years, we see no activity in the mining district. Heavy snowfall, limited technology. Between 1877 and 1878, we see the district as really off the map. No one is interested in wasting their money to go find gold. And if any of you have ever tried getting gold, you understand that it takes a lot more money to make a lot of gold. And if you don't have any money and you're looking for gold, you get specks maybe in your pan. Anyway, during this time, 1878, we see Oglesby, one of our characters of the Bohemia Mining District, start to, he gets engaged with Company G of the 2nd Oregon State Militia and is involved in an engagement near Willow Springs during the Bannock Indian War. He is wounded in the knee at this point, and that injury lasted with him for his entire life. But it also symbolizes the first, I don't want to call it death, but the first problem of the Bohemia Mining District, because his injury incapacitated him for life, and this first injury for gold mining incapacitates our Bohemia Mining District for the rest of its life. 1889, we see L.F. Woolley of the Cottage Grove Leader visiting the Bohemia Mining District and explains that it is a ghost town. No signs of life whatsoever. He does find traces of organized life, such as papers and maybe names carved into things like Chadwick, Barker, Newbrant, and Gale. But the trails have deteriorated, the buildings are collapsing, and his story, though it sounds in despair, it actually marks the first revival of the district, or the second revival maybe. By the late 1880s, prospectors returned to Bohemia. 1889, we see Grouse Mountain, Sharps Creek, and the old knot grounds come back to life again. Reports say that the knot mine still has 2 deep shafts at this point, and nearby claims, which would later be known as the Pearson Star and Sharp Silver Star, were noted again for free milling ore. So folks saw that newspaper article and decide, no one else is up there, I could go get some gold, and the industry sparks back to life in Bohemia. Why the revival was different this time, because familiar names reappear like Oglesby and Adams, who were first old-timers of the original district, the original town. And at this point, we see California, Arizona, Nevada, and other districts, miners getting tired of what's going on in their district and being tired of the overcrowded nature of where they are, and they start moving up here with better milling knowledge and more capital. The Turning Point discoveries confirm extensive gold-bearing quartz ledges. Oglesby and Pearson, and this photo right here is of Henry D. Pearson. They find rich outcrops near Grouse Mountain and the Annie Mine. Around this abandoned camp, the Music, the Champion, and the Helena begin their journey. In 1891, James Music finds his way over to what would later be known as the current Bohemia City and the Music Mine, and he starts working his claim there. This is significant because this is a stone's throw away from the original city that hundreds of people before him had already looked at and overlooked the potential for a serious cash cow that the Music Mine ultimately became. He stakes 2 claims and he partners with fellows named Cook and Bradley to form the Bohemia Gold Mine and Mill Company. By 1892, he buys a 5-stamp mill, hauling it up into the district. Hauling is brutal at about 3.5 cents per pound, and early proofs from the Music Mine recovered $4,000 worth of gold in a 9-day run. And then, as you see in the later years, 13,000, 15,000, 17,000 as the years go on, and it only got better from there shortly after that. So, Red Bridge is built in 1897. In 1897, the Music Mine has the single largest output of $35,000 at the time. And for what it's worth, at this time in history, gold, I'm pretty sure gold is worth $20.67 an ounce. So imagine how much gold would have had to come out of the Music Mine to create a $35,000 year. That's wild to me. So in 1898, we see Hardscrabble Ridge begin to take place, and Lane County, I believe Lane County, pays $700 to help build that road. In 1889, the Music Mine sold for $85,000, and in 1902, it consolidated with the Champion and Helena under the Calapooya Mining and Tunnel Company. The Music did one thing for all of the other mines that were in the district, and it proved that there is serious money to be made in the Bohemia Mining District. So, going back in time just a little bit, we see the Annie Mine. In 1890, Oglesby and Henry Pearson discover rich gold-bearing quartz near the summit of Grouse Mountain. The find was close to the old Knot working, so the old Knot mine became the Annie Mine, or at least it was close to it. The name the Annie was made after his daughter. Early development and success of the Annie Mine, the first thing they start to do right around 1891, or sorry, not 1891, but the first way they start processing the ore is with a jig stamp mill, and I looked all over the internet to try and find a photo of a jig stamp mill, and I couldn't. So this is an AI interpretation of what a jig stamp mill might have looked like. I can't confirm or deny whether that's real or not, but it looks legit to me. We see John McGee in 1891 becomes superintendent of the Annie Mine, and the old Knot mill was purchased, dismantled, and moved downhill and rebuilt for use at the mine. After all those improvements, their first run netted them $10,000 in gold. In 1892, the Annie Trail was built from Care's Ranch at Wildwood on the Row River, crossing Grizzly Mountain to reach the mine. So I did some mapping on what the Annie Trail likely is. And the Annie Trail is likely, it would be on the north side of Row River, or on Bryce Creek, the north side of Bryce Creek. And then it crossed over right about Champion Saddle Road, roughly, going up to the mountain, over Grizzly, and into the Annie Mine. So, and that old Annie Trail is likely Road NF 2212 which is the Noonday Trail, known as now. I've not confirmed that. Anyway, Andy Nelson, the father of Bohemia Mining Days historian Ray Nelson, and Jack Klopfenstein arrive on foot, and they found the mill buried in snow with only a smokestack sticking about 3 feet above the drift. Even still, they dug their way in there and started mining operations. This is a photo of a 20 stamp mill, because in 1896 the Annie mine was sold to the Noonday Company of Chicago after some success, or maybe failures, depending on how you look at it. And they buy a 20 stamp mill with 8 concentrators, 2 boilers, and a 60 horsepower engine to have delivered and brought up Bohemia Mining District. This is a photo of some other one out in the United States, but that's massive. A 5 stamp mill is massive. This is a 20 stamp mill, and the amount of work taken to get this from the bottom of the mountain to the top is astronomical. The Champion mine emerges in 1905 through the ledge that was known much earlier along the Knot Trail. So basically, the Knot Trail going up would have, well, I suppose the Knot Trail would have been Champion Saddle Road now. The Annie would have been Noonday. It's hard because no one keeps track of all this stuff. So the Champion mine emerges, and they immediately buy a 10 stamp mill in 1895, and ore was carried by a 3,400 foot aerial tramway down Champion Saddle to the mill on Champion Creek. By 1898, 5 stamps were running at the Champion mill for $40 ore, workings less than 100 feet deep. So they were having a good time. In 1900, PJ Pat Jennings bought the mine and consolidated it with the Helena mine. And we haven't touched on him yet, we're going to, but I just want to say that one of the most influential figures of the entire mining district history was Patrick PJ Jennings. I forget his middle name. I knew it at one point. Oh, interesting. There was a picture of him here. I must have accidentally deleted it. It was there a couple hours ago, I promise. Anyway, by 1902, Jennings announced they had purchased 21 claims, 16 at the Champion, 2 at the Mitchell, 2 at the Graber, and 1 at the Hoff. Anyway, he establishes the Kalapuya Mining and Tunnel Corporation, was capitalized at $3 million, and had massive plans for the mining district. Anyway, this is PJ Jennings at about 35 years old. We didn't go deep into trying to restore this picture because it gets the point across. Jennings was also deeply involved in promoting the railroad from Cottage Grove to the Bohemia Mining District. In May 1902, the railroad project was ceremonially launched with a short 25-foot extension that was extended to eventually go all the way around Dorena Lake. Interesting thing here, he was very interested about having a train not just go to the mining district, but all the way up into it, because freight prices were so astronomically high for him that he thought if he could get a train all the way up the mountain that it would save him a bunch of money. And he would have been right if he could have made the rest of that train journey happen. So we kind of double over onto some information just because of how I was collecting all of it, but the Champion became part of a larger system here. Now we get into the Helena mine. I had a really hard time finding any photos of the Helena. It was real hard to find historic photos of the Helena, which was at one point one of the biggest bigger mines in the district. But what I did find was a rough logo of a company that owned the Helena mine at some point, some photos of some ruins, and the rough location on a map. But we see CB Charlie Bruneau discovered the Helena Ledge in 1896 on the trail on Grizzly Mountain. In 1897, R.J. and P.J. Jennings joined the property and bought out Hugh Benny and began active development with Bruneau. By 1899, the Helena Group included 6 claims, and the mine quickly gained attention. We see a couple of other photos here of the Helena. These are drawings of, so you see the bottom left is a drawing of the different levels of the Helena mine at the point that this report was written. And then the Helena extension, or the broader Helena group would have been on that map. And these are actual photos and somewhat recent history of the Helena mine that I found online. But we see rich streaks with 3,000 or more per ton. And then in, the Bohemia Mining District was not just about gold. The thing is, gold, lead, silver, copper, zinc, and even platinum have been found up in the mining district along with some other metals. But by 1903, the Oregon Securities Company consolidated the Helena. And then we see the Vesuvius. In 1897, Johnny and Gottfried Graber and the Zinnecker brothers purchased the Vesuvius claim on Fairview Mountain. By 1900, they had opened the upper Vesuvius ledge and milled $5,000 from the ore. In 1902, after driving a long tunnel beneath the ore body, they broke into a glittering zone of gold-bearing rock with some specimens reported to run as high as $29,000 per ton. The strike drew immediate attention, and the property was soon taken over by F.J. Hard. So F.J. Hard and the Vesuvius Mines Company and the property expanded into the district's major operations with roads, a 10-stamp mill, and an 1,800-foot tramway. By 1921, the mine had more than 7,000 feet of tunnels, and after World War I and the deaths of F.J. Hard and the son Charles, the mine fell idle. In 1949, we see the High Potential Mines Company leased the Vesuvius and later purchased it in 1958 and began reopening the old workings in search of new grade ore. One of the other big things in the mining district was copper, and some of the early copper mines we see are the Oregon, Colorado, and the Riverside mines. One of the reasons that copper's been an important resource, but one of the reasons that copper became an important resource is because during, and I don't think it was applicable here, but during World War II, the government put a ban on gold mining, and copper mining was still allowed. So the Oregon, Colorado was discovered around 1898 and showed a wide vein carrying gold and silver and up to 33% copper. The Riverside, just nearby the Oregon, Colorado, opened in 1899 and followed a similar path. Both mines showed that Bohemia's future was not just in free gold. So on this map here, it's hard to see, but I've got a little arrow pointed towards the J on that map. That is where the Oregon, Colorado would be. And the conglomeration in kind of the center of the map, that would be where Bohemia City is. So the music mine and all that. So not every claim on the district became a great producer. There was quite a few that didn't make a lot of good money, that's for sure. The district is roughly 60 square miles, and its main mineralized belt stretches roughly 5.5 miles by 1.5 miles wide. By 1902, we see nearly 2,000 mining claims in Bohemia at one time, and I believe it was about this time that it was reported that around 1,800 people would have lived in Bohemia. So beyond the famous mines, we see a whole list there that I'm not going to read. One of which is the crystal, which comes back later because P.J. Jennings ended up buying the crystal and then the lead crystal. These are two separate mines. He stuck with the district into 30s, I think. This photo right here is from Noelle Bandy. This is James Miller, her not her grandfather, but her grandfather's best friend, to the best of my knowledge. And he's just chilling in that ore cart. I thought that was good. So we loop back again to the Oregon Securities Company that modernizes Bohemia. This company really took everything that in the beginning was just loose gold mining and doing your best and using manual tools, and they ended up really expanding into milling operations and steam power and electricity, and really expanded the district technologically. One of the things that would have been on the list is Lund Park. Lund Park was named, and I don't have a slide for it, which I should, but Lund Park was named by Harry Parker and Alex Lundberg, who had founded that area, and it was actually its own small community with a hydroelectric dam, a warehouse, a barn, a few homes. This was its own town, so to speak. And Harry Parker was the mayor of Lund Park. I say mayor with quotes because I'm not sure if it was ever a real town or not in the eyes of the state of Oregon. But summer of 1905, miners broke the famous high-grade zone where gold-encrusted ore ran as high as $30,000 per ton. But after the panic of 1907, the company was reorganized as the West Coast Mines Company, marking the close of Oregon Securities Company. So this is a photo that I got from Barbara and Hewlett. This was a photo in the Pat Jennings collection. This is of a gold amalgam. So this is mercury mixed with gold, and it is a ginormous gold sponge. If you imagine that this pan is likely this big around, that is bigger than a softball. Fun fact about Pat Jennings, before we get too far off course, he was once on his way into town, and he had a bunch of money on him along with a $30,000 gold brick, and he had boarded a train to go deposit his gold brick at some place, and he ended up getting robbed. And these folks took all of his money, not realizing that he had gold bricks in his bag worth $30,000 at the time, which is incredible to me. On a slightly different note, that's part of the reason why we got the first national bank in Cottage Grove, because folks were afraid to get their gold stolen. So after World War I, we see rising costs and fixed government prices, and working in Bohemia became increasingly difficult. So the Champion continued only intermittently under the Bartels family through the Evening Star, and then a favorable 1930-31 geological survey reported renewed interest by calling Bohemia one of the most promising mining districts in the Cascades. So right as World War I takes off, we see one of the more recent declines as men are going off to war and women are joining the workforce, and mining becomes a last priority for most folks. So it kind of died down at this point for a little bit. But once we hit the 1920s and 30s, there's another revival that happens. We see the Noonday, the Helena, and the Music all take off again, with ores estimated at 2.7 million. And then they also expand into lead, copper, and zinc mining as well, to try and get the most bang for their buck, and as technology has increased now with improved flotation devices. But this is a brief moment of revival because World War II is just around the corner. World War II shut down gold mining with the War Production Board Order of L208 in 1942. So this puts a complete stop to the Bohemia Mining District because on top of they needed folks to go to war, Now you legally cannot go gold mining. And I believe it was apart from this, but I believe that it was at this time established that you could only own up to 5 ounces of gold. But I might be missing the timeline there. After World War II, we see a resurgence as miners come back from war and they start building back up. The music, the Helena and the Champion. You know, the mining district really never recovered from its 1910s era heyday. By the mid-1950s, we see testing and milling work at up to $42 per ton in some places. Renewed exploration took diamond drilling at the Champion mine in the mid-1960s, and then the area went largely dormant after 1965. Now we enter the 1970s, and this is really where my story actually comes in. And I know that might be hard to believe, but because of that fella right there, that is Ray Nelson. His father, Andy Nelson, was a miner in the heyday of Bohemia Mining District, and he remembered all the stories that he'd hear around the campfires from all these folks that were working in the district, because he lived in the district as well. At one point, he decided he needed to write those things down, and it was reported at one point his notebook was 8 inches thick of stories and research that he had done. But it's by the efforts of Ray Nelson that we know a lot of what happened at the Bohemia Mining District, because of how proactive he was in writing all that down. That said, in the 70s, this is well beyond when he was writing stuff down, he took a different approach. He was really trying to protect the mining district from vandals and looters and folks that were just going up there to go scrap metal. The real reason that, well, I don't know about the reason, but all the miners that have stuff now, all of the people that own the mines now are very protective over what they have, and they don't want to tell anyone what they have because of these things. Because as the course of history has showed them, people will go and take things that don't belong to them. They will, you know, destroy buildings, get hurt in them, things like that. And the 70s had a real problem with this concept. We get into the modern era where the reality is the mining district has dissolved. There is no gold mining happening in Cottage Grove, at least on a massive scale. People still own mines and there are still things happening. The Bohemia Mine Owners Association is still one of the most, it's I believe the oldest mining association in the country. There's several hundred active members there that actively go out in the mining district and out in the creeks and go pan for gold or have claims or all this sorts of stuff. But now we're entering the modern era where there just isn't the kind of industrial need for that to resurge yet. But I do have a theory, and my theory is that with the astronomical prices of gold, that within the next couple of years, we're going to see another resurge of our mining district once again. But that brings us to the modern day, and that is, for the most part, the entire presentation. But I have a couple of photos I want to share with you. I recently met Noelle Bandy, who her father, or her great-grandfather, was Peter Christensen. And he built a plethora of things in Cottage Grove, very experienced builder. He built the Woodard Library, if anyone's familiar with that, and then helped with the Cottage Grove Hospital and a variety of other things, along with building the mines at the Sultana Mine and the Green Rock Milling Company and all that stuff. These are a couple of photos from her collection of Peter and James Miller and some of her relatives. He had a huge influence in Lund Park, the exact details of which I'm still learning. I have to make another appointment with her to go back through the photos and take better notes this time. But we see his parrot on, I don't remember if it was James's or Peter's, but that's a parrot on top of the Lund Park sign. And then we see the parrot later on in another photo. But that cabin in the middle was Peter Christensen's cabin at Lund Park, covered in who knows what because the photo is too blurry. But we see the light and power station over there. There's the photo of the parrot on, I don't think that photo is of Peter Christensen. It might be Harry Parker or Thomas Parker, I don't know. Figuring out the details of these photos is a process and it takes time. Barbara and Hewlett has been absolutely instrumental in giving me the knowledge that I do have over the mining district, and these are a couple of photos from her archive from her great-grandfather, P.J. Jennings. These show different aspects of life in the mining district and the different types of homes and machinery that they would have had, as well as them hauling up mining equipment into the district on a truck in likely the early 1920s. And then that photo on the top right, you see there's a whole plethora of people working in there doing something. And then the bottom right is Pat Jennings working with his blacksmith and then a steam drill. I forget the exact name. So I just wanted to share a couple of those photos with you because one of the other things we do in an effort to try and learn about our history is we digitize old photos. If you have old photos of your family or folks you know from the mining district, you can keep them. We just really want to make copies. So if you have photos that you would be willing to share, please reach out. My email is spiritofbmd@gmail.com. Please reach out. If you have photos, we'd love to see them. We'd love to get copies because we don't want to take your family heirloom, but we want to share it with the world. There is a long list of sources here. And if you didn't know, Spirit of Bohemia Mining Days has started also doing a history pub over at Saginaw Vineyard. We don't present every month. We just coordinate the event and make sure it happens. So thank you all for coming. We have some trivia questions now.